Science Unwrapped? How many of you have been here before? Lots of people, great. Anyone here for the first time or hasn't been here in a long time? Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about how this works. We'll spend about an hour in this room, during which time our guest speaker, Dr. Karin Kettenring, will tell you about her interesting research on Great Salt Lake wetlands and some interesting non-native plants. And then about 8 o'clock, after we give you a little time to ask questions, we'll adjourn. So after Karin finishes talking, we'll have about 10 minutes for you to ask questions about anything you're interested in. So when she stops talking, don't immediately bolt out of the room, even though you know there's an awful lot of cool stuff out in the halls. So her talk is cool also, I've seen it. So that's how it works. Karin was raised in New Jersey, so she's an East Coaster by birth, but she's been gradually moving west since she went to college in Ohio, moved on to Minnesota, had a brief detour back to the East Coast. She has the details of that in her presentation, so I won't belabor them. She did her graduate work at University of Minnesota, where she studied plant ecology and especially restoration ecology. And her interest is primarily in management and restoration of wetlands. She did work on the Chesapeake Bay wetlands as a postdoctoral scientist, and then in 2008 she moved to Utah. And although she still has work in wetlands elsewhere, including the Chesapeake Bay, most of her work now is here in the Great Salt Lake area wetlands, which she'll talk about tonight. You will see that Karin has a big lab. Lots of students work with her. They are energetic, creative researchers, and they have an enormous number of way cool things to mess around with when we get done with the talk in here. Karin's talk this evening is entitled Mighty Phragmites Controlling Plant Invaders in Great Salt Lake Wetlands.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me out there? Okay, just getting mic'd up. And I think he's going to dim the lights. Oh, maybe not quite that much. Great. What a great crowd. Phragmites on a Friday night. Here we are. Well, first of all, I'm very excited to be here to tell you about the research that we have been doing in my lab over the last few years. The focus of part of the discussion tonight is going to be on Phragmites, this invasive grass. That is the focus of this picture here. But I also want to begin with, sorry for the light show here, begin with a brief introduction to wetlands, Wetlands 101. So we're going to talk about the importance of stinky, buggy, mushy wetlands. So let's unwrap some science. So what is a wetland? Some of you, many of you here probably don't know what a wetland is. So let's get some basics started. And of course, we're in school, so we might as well start with a quiz. I'm going to show you a few pictures of wetlands. You can decide, well, some of them are wetlands, some of them are not. You can decide if they are wetlands. If you think it's a wetland, raise your hand wildly. And let's see who passes this quiz. All right, raise your hand if you think that's a wetland. All right, I'll see a few hands being waved wildly and a few more. Okay, if you are raising your hand, you are correct. How about this? Does this look like a wetland to you? Oh, there's some doubters, huh? In fact, this is a wetland. This is a beaver dam, a wetland formed by a beaver dam. Maybe it's partly because you can't see it very well, but I took this photo up Logan Canyon. So the first couple were pretty easy. How about this, though? What do you think? Okay, still some yeses. There's no water visible here, but this is actually definitely a wetland. But what about this? Yeah. I'm losing some people here. Even some of the wetland ecologists in the crowd are confused. This is a wetland, particularly in the back, but you can see, maybe you're confused by the lack of water. I see some cracking in the soils, which is a sign that there once was water here, and maybe not in the not too distant past. How about this? Is this a wetland? This is the Great Salt Lake, in case you were wondering. And one final quiz One final picture for the quiz. Who thinks that this is a wetland? These are the Bonneville Salt Flats, so not a wetland, at least at this point. Okay, so I think most of you passed the quiz, but not everybody. So let's go over here and talk about what exactly is a wetland and what the basic ingredients are. So you saw some pictures. You saw some pictures of what were definitely wetlands. What were things that you noticed? What did you know? What were some of the attributes you saw?
Water.
Water, right. You need to have the wet part of wetland. Okay, so we're gonna create a wetland here. We've got some water. Ingredient number 1. All right. I saw Cassidy raising her hand there. Any other ingredients in a wetland? You got one?
Land or plants.
Land or plants. Okay, I'm gonna go with the plants. I like the way you're thinking. Conveniently, we've got some wetland plants. I'm gonna dump them in. All right. However, we are missing the star of the night. All right, this is maybe not the most practical plant to try to have in my wetland, but here is my Phragmites as part of my wetland. Okay, so we've got 2 essential ingredients. We've got water, we have plants, and there's something specific about the plants that's called hydrophytic vegetation. These are plants that live in wetlands, plants that love water. What's the 3rd essential ingredient? How do you know that something is a wetland? Crocodiles. I love it. Who's seen a crocodile in a wetland in Utah? Okay, there are definitely lots of crocodiles in wetlands. I was just in Florida and there were a lot. But we're missing one other essential ingredient. This one might be a little bit harder. What happens when you have water? What happens below ground? Anybody?
Bugs.
Bugs? Okay, so I think I might be stumping a few people here, but the other essential ingredient in a wetland is because you have this ponding, this flooding in a wetland, you have soils that are low in oxygen or have almost no oxygen. So you have the formation of what we call hydric soils. These are soils that form under these low oxygen conditions, and because of those conditions, there are particular chemical reactions that occur. And so you get different coloring and different characteristics of the soil. And so if I was digging in a wetland, well, actually, some of this is potting soil, but you don't need to know that. There's also some wetland soil in here, and I would notice particular colors and qualities about the soils because they are flooded and low in oxygen. So now let's look a little bit more deeply into hydric soils. But to bring it all together, we're looking for water, we're looking for hydrophytes, cattails, bulrushes, those plants we find in wetlands. We're looking for hydric soils. Where did all the oxygen go? The oxygen has been replaced by water. So the soils part is pretty interesting. There's a whole bunch of different characteristics that we can look for, and in fact, if you go out after the presentation, there'll be some hydric soils that you can touch and feel and sniff. This young woman in the photo here clearly regrets the fact that she sniffed this wetland soil, right? So let's find out why that is, and let me see if I can get the technology to work. We are going to hear from one of the local wetland experts about hydric soils. And I might have muted this. Let me try that again. Oh, maybe not.
My name is Becca Downard, and I'm a graduate student at Utah State. I study plants in the wetlands around the Great Salt Lake, and part of studying plants is digging soil pits and looking at how the soils have changed being flooded within wetlands. So to do that, I take my sharpshooter, it's a rectangular shovel, and I dig a long hole, so I have a face that I can slice off, just like a cake. And then I take my soils, and I lay them out on a tarp and look at how they have changed. So the first thing I look at in my soils is how deep the roots go. If you look at our non-wetland soil, you can't really see a very deep layer full of roots. But if you look at this soil that I pulled out of a cattail marsh, you can see that we've got about 6 inches of big roots and little roots. So it's clearly different from our non-wetland soil. The other thing I do is I sniff it to see what it smells like. So since this is a wetland soil, it smells like rotten eggs. It's got a lot of hydrogen sulfide gas. The last thing that I look at is the way the colors have changed in the soil over time. So remember, our non-wetland soil, it's nice and brownish, reddish. In our wetland soils, there's not a lot of oxygen because they've been flooded for a while. And when there's not a lot of oxygen, iron and manganese get transformed into different forms that have a different color than their oxygenated version. And that leads to colors like this. They're kind of grayish, bluish. And if they've been without oxygen for a lot longer, the iron and manganese actually become water soluble and they leave the soil profile, leaving soils that are the same color as the rocks that they weathered from.
We will be hearing from her again in a few minutes. I'm going to go back. Let's see if I left my pointer. I forgot my pointer. Okay, so hopefully you got some more clues into how hydric soils work. Again, if you want to hear more, we can follow up with that after the presentation. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about what do I do as a wetland ecologist? What does my lab do as wetland ecologists? And wait a minute, what is ecology anyway? Some of you may not even be familiar with ecology, which is our scientific field of study. Ecology is a subdiscipline of biology, and ecologists study living organisms and the interactions of these organisms with the environment. So, for instance, I study wetland plants, and I look at the interaction between plants and water and salinity, these low oxygen conditions. I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am today. It's a little bit of a windy road. And as Nancy alluded to in my introduction, it all began in New Jersey, surprisingly. And somehow I ended up in Utah, one of the most arid states in the country, studying wetlands. So it is a little ironic, but it actually began with a pufferfish. We went on a wonderful field trip when I was in elementary school. I grew up in suburban countryside outside of New York City, and I had not really explored the wetlands and the aquatic environments of my home state. But we headed down south and went trawling off the southern tip of New Jersey. And I still remember very distinctly as a 3rd or 4th grader that one of the catches in our trawl was this pufferfish. And I thought, wow, this is just amazing. And it was one of those eye-opening experiences to realize how much diversity is out there that is right around you and you don't even realize it's there. So that really got me keyed into studying biology. From there I headed though to a college. I moved out to northern Ohio, and I was pretty sure I was going to actually study math, and then I moved on to chemistry. And then as I realized, kind of went back to my roots and realized I want to be outside studying all the interesting, cool things around me. So I quickly switched to a biology major, and I ran off to try to sign up for the most popular biology class, which I'm sure was some mammal class with lots of fuzzy, cute, charismatic mammals that everybody wanted to learn about. Well, the class was full, and I ended up in a class with Dr. David Benzing, who you can see here, he had the only class with spots left. It turned out to be a plant ecology class. And I was pretty bummed that I was in a plant class. It turned out to be the most interesting class I had ever taken. His excitement, his enthusiasm for science, his enthusiasm for plants and the diversity of plants out there and all the different environments in which they live and the different adaptations that plants have, just was truly inspiring. So just had a great time hiking around northern Ohio with him. So from there, interestingly, I managed to get a job in Utah right after I graduated from college. moved out to Zion National Park and worked in on a wetland vegetation project. I was loving the wetlands work that I was doing, but I was not sure that was exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I did go and do a couple diversions. I tracked desert tortoises in the Mojave Desert. And then I actually went as far as the Negev Desert in southern Israel and tracked isopods, these tiny little roly-poly bugs. And after those desert experiences, I realized that wetlands really were where I wanted to be. So I signed up as a golden gopher, headed off to graduate school, found a wonderful mentor in Susan Gladowicz, who you can see in the bottom right there. She's a great wetland ecologist. Had a lot of great support from my family, and I was in graduate school for quite a long time, but they stuck with me through that time period. Eventually moved on to the Chesapeake Bay, where I worked with another great mentor, Dennis Wiggum, who's another wetland ecologist, and had the chance to explore totally different wetlands. In Minnesota, I was working in prairie wetlands. In Maryland, I was working in brackish tidal wetlands. And then a wonderful job opened up here in Utah. So here I am today. So that's a little bit of a windy path, but maybe we should think a little bit about what other people's experiences are being a wetland ecologist. A lot of people have superheroes that they aspire to be like. Unfortunately, for wetland scientists, our superhero is a little less sexy and glamorous. This is Swamp Thing, you may recognize. Nonetheless, we do share a lot in common with Swamp Thing in that we love getting muddy, stinky, walking around in mushy, swampy lands. Okay, hopefully this is better for everybody. Okay, so I have a feeling there may be some other wetland ecologists out there in the audience, and I thought maybe we could hear from some of them and just hear about, oh, in fact, there is a wetland ecologist. Well, hello there, wetland ecologist. Tell us who you are and tell us what's the best and worst thing about being a wetland ecologist.
All right, well, my name is Christine Rohal. I'm one of Karin's master's students. And the best thing for me about being a wetland ecologist is getting to go out in the field and finding lots of surprises. Every time I go out there, there's something new that I've never seen before, whether it's a new bird song that I've never heard or a slimy bug that just crawls under my shoe that just, catches my notice, and I just love that. So what I don't like about being a wetland ecologist, well, one of the things that I don't like is that I don't like that the Great Salt Lake wetlands have this terrible reputation for being super stinky. But what is really stinky is a group of scientists that I go out in the field with on a hot summer day and then climb into the car after we're done. So
it's a long drive home.
Yeah, it's a long drive home. 2 hours.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine. You'll be seeing a little bit more of her research in a few minutes. Let's see, are there any other wetland ecologists out there? Oh, there's another one. All right, tell us who you are and a little bit about some interesting experiences you've had in some wetlands.
My name is Becca Downard, and I'm a graduate student with Karin. I study the wetlands around the Great Salt Lake, and there's been some mishaps in the 4 years that I've been doing field work out around the Great Salt Lake. I lost my boss's car keys, and I never found them. And I lost a pair of waders, and I have been lost in the Phragmites myself quite a few times. But there's also been some really, really great experiences. One of the times that I was lost, I ran into a llama. It was amazing.
Who knew? A llama in wetlands in Utah.
I had never heard of it.
All right. Yeah, there might be. Are there any other I think there's one more wetland ecologist who wants to speak with us tonight. Okay, tell us who you are and what you love about doing wetland research.
Okay, I'm Delina Williams, and I'm an undergrad student that works with Karin. And what I love about being a wetland ecologist is that I get to do these cool projects that we can experiment ideas and actually get cool results that we can apply to restoration. And I also love knowing that the work that I'm doing now can actually help these wetlands and help the wildlife that, use the wetlands as a home and for other things that they need. So I love the wildlife.
Thank you. Great. Okay, well, hopefully you have a better sense of what on earth we do as wetland ecologists. Let's move on. And so now you know what we do, but what do wetlands do? Wetlands are valued by many people, but do you have a sense of why that is? So let's think about a few reasons why wetlands are interesting. What do wetlands do? I saw an eager participant over there. Go ahead.
They let animals live in it.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. So wetlands provide important habitat for wildlife, such as this amazing photo shot by Gary Crandall, who's one of the great photographers working on the Great Salt Lake. Oh, gross. Who put this in? Wetlands. Kidneys? Why are wetlands considered kidneys? Can anybody help me out here?
Clean the water.
Oh, I heard a clean the water. Okay, well, in fact, that is correct. So I talked about some of the interesting things that happen in the soil when you have those flooded conditions. There's actually this whole community of microbes. We call them the microbe gang in my house. So what does the microbe gang do? One of the things that the microbe gang does is actually can convert nitrogen, which is a pollutant. It's in fertilizer from agriculture, from our lawns. It's harmful in our drinking water. The microbe gang can actually convert this harmful form of nitrogen into an innocuous form of nitrogen gas. And so that's partly why wetlands are thought of as kidneys, because they're able to actually purify the water and improve the quality of water up to a certain extent. This might push a wetland over the top by how polluted it is, but generally wetlands are good that way. A sponge. How might wetlands be a sponge? Got a lot of excitement in the front row. I'm going to try to spread it out a little bit. Let's see, Jasper. The soil absorbs the water.
That's what makes the oxygen run out.
So you're right though that the soil in wetlands actually has kind of a spongy water absorbing capacity. So in that soil video you saw Becca was talking about the roots and all the dead plant material in the soil. Well, that can actually kind of serve as a sponge to hold moisture. And then of course wetlands are depressions. They're kind of like a bathtub, but maybe a little bit more shallow. So it can serve as a holding place for water and let water more slowly return back into the hydrologic cycle after a rain event or after snowmelt. And so a great example of this, we learned the hard way about the role of wetlands in mitigating floods when back in the 90s there was actually a very heavy precipitation, very heavy winter snowpack, and in the springtime there was massive, massive flooding. The flooding occurred in large part because there were no wetlands. There were not many wetlands left to actually absorb that water. So along the Mississippi River, and this is the Missouri one, that tributaries, there was large-scale flooding, loss of property, obviously millions of dollars in damage. And similarly, we saw this more recently, the consequences of losing these wetlands and their buffering capacity with Hurricane Katrina and Rita when it hit the Gulf Coast. Hopefully most of you remember what happened in New Orleans, which is literally built on a wetland. Because of a lot of the wetlands have been lost there, a lot of the coastal wetlands, there was not the strength of the hurricane hit full on, and there was massive flooding again and loss of life. So hopefully that gives you a better sense of some of the cool things that wetlands do. And of course, as humans, we appreciate wetlands for their aesthetic values, as you can see in the upper right here, but also for the recreation benefits that we get, right? Bird watching, canoeing, kayaking, and of course hunting. Hunting is an important part of the culture here in Utah and a significant portion of our economy. So we've talked about what wetlands do, but what are the types of wetlands that we have in Utah? I want to just give you a quick rundown, and we'll do a quick tour of the state of Utah. So interestingly, less than 1% of our state is wetlands. And they're actually spread throughout the state in a number of different regions. So let me walk you through it. First, let's venture to the southeastern portion of the state, to the Colorado Plateau. Here, most of the wetlands are what we would call riparian wetlands. These are found along the major rivers and streams, the tributaries of these rivers. So the Colorado, the San Juan, the Green Rivers. So for instance, in the lower right here, this is the Green River and the Colorado River over here. You can see some of these riparian wetlands, those little green strips along the river there. And so those are critical wetland habitat. In areas where the canyons are much steeper, there's not much room essentially left for the wetlands. So you usually see them where the valleys are more broad and more open. We also have a lot of wetlands in some of our higher elevations in our alpine environments. So for instance, along the Uinta Mountains here, as well as the Bear River Range. And so some of these wetlands are glacial lake wetlands. So a nice example would be this picture in the lower left. So we have the lake itself, but along the periphery are wetlands where you have that hydrophytic vegetation, you have the hydric soil formation and so forth. Wet meadows are another type of wetland that you find up in these areas. These are seasonal wetlands, and they're usually dominated by grass-like plants, mostly called sedges. These are plants with triangular stems. And again, riparian wetlands are important in these areas, as well as beaver ponds, like that picture I showed you a few slides back. And finally, the basin and range. These are the wetlands that you're probably most familiar with. So these are the wetlands that we have along the Great Salt Lake, up to Bear Lake, down to Utah Lake, and everything in between, and out in the West Desert as well. So what do these wetlands look like? These are emergent wetlands. When you think of a wetland, probably the first image that comes to your mind would be an emergent wetland. These are wetlands that are dominated by cattails, bulrushes, and so forth. So for instance, here's a nice picture of an emergent wetland here. There's also floodplain mud flats, and they're kind of what they sound like. They're mud flats, meaning that they're mostly mud, and maybe there's some plants that establish there for a short window in the spring, and they are found in floodplains of rivers and streams, as well as playas. You can see this playa wetland over here on the right-hand side. Playas have very high salt concentrations, and because of that, not many plants can actually live there. So there's just a few different types of plants that can live just on the edges where the salt levels are just about right, just about right for those particular plants. What is so unique about Great Salt Lake wetlands? So maybe you're familiar with where most of these wetlands are. They're dominated on the east side of the Great Salt Lake. You can see most of the wetlands highlighted in this darker blue color here. Most of these wetlands are managed either by the state, waterfowl management areas, or WMAs, and hopefully you can see some of the major ones here, for instance, along Farmington Bay, Ogden Bay. The other major wetland complex, though, is actually a federal refuge. This is the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, which is up here. And then Nature Conservancy has wetland property on the north side of the Great Salt Lake. And actually, even Kennecott has wetlands. They've got mitigation wetlands called the Inland Sea Shorebird Reserve. So what is so unique about Great Salt Lake wetlands? Well, I'm going to come back to this in a second, and I want to actually show you just a short video clip that was taken from the Bear River Refuge. This is a movie. It's actually 25 minutes long, so I'm only going to show you 2 minutes of it. But it was developed by the Friends of the Bear River Refuge, which you should go visit if you have never been there before. So let's take a quick look at some of the cool wildlife, cool birds that are found here. So this video is called Wings of Thunder. I heard somebody protesting. This is a truly remarkable video, and if you'd like to actually see the whole, I encourage you to watch the whole movie. And if you have never been to the Bear River Refuge, it is also a truly remarkable place. So I hope this will inspire you to go check it out in person. So let's get back to what I was just about to show you in the slide, which connects to those birds. So the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. Why are our wetlands so important on the Great Salt Lake? It's because of where we sit in terms of migratory bird pathways. So you probably realize that every year, millions upon millions of birds are migrating north and south, heading up to Alaska and Canada in the summertime, heading south when winter comes. And you can actually see here in this map both the Pacific Flyway and the Central Flyway here in purple. Where's the Great Salt Lake? It's right here in the middle. And I think what's so interesting is you can see that rather than staying on this nice linear flyway path, birds are veering off course and coming to the Great Salt Lake. Our wetlands are critical for millions of birds that are on these migratory pathways. So now I want to show you a picture of 5 birds that Great Salt Lake wetlands in particular are critical for them. So you're going to see pictures of birds, and you're going to see a little statistic at the bottom that tells you about what is the role Great Salt Lake wetlands play for those particular birds. Aren't those amazing? Truly cool, really remarkable birds. So now that you have a sense of what wetlands do and the important role wetlands play for these migratory birds, let's talk about a little bit of a depressing topic, which is how have we impacted our wetlands? How have we impacted humankind's waterlogged wealth? That's kind of a silly name, but I think that you all hopefully have a good understanding of the cool things that wetlands do. Unfortunately, in the US, we've lost about half of our wetlands already. So that is a little bit depressing. Utah has lost about 30% of its wetlands. Here we are here. You can see where the greatest amount of wetlands have been lost. That's what's shown in red. So areas shown in red, 80 to 100% of the wetlands have been lost. So California in particular has lost maybe 90% of their wetlands. And then this is the Corn Belt. So when we talk about how wetlands have been lost, it's a number of different reasons. So it's filling for development, stream channelization, loss of riparian wetlands, damming, mining some wetlands for peat. That people use in horticulture, a variety of things. Agriculture in particular has been one way that many, many wetlands have been lost, and that in particular has happened in the Midwest because some of those wetland soils are also really good for agriculture, so it's not too surprising. What are the biggest threats to Utah's wetlands today? Water. Certainly, it is the year of water, right? That's partly why we're putting on this series about the Great Salt Lake. So water quality issues are certainly a big problem for Great Salt Lake wetlands and many other wetlands in the state. Looking to the future, climate change is going to be particularly affecting the quantity of water reaching our wetlands. So as I talked about before, many of the wetlands on the Great Salt Lake are fed by the Bear River, the Jordan River, and the Weber River. The water in those rivers is coming obviously from the mountains, largely in the form of snowpack melting in the spring. So the timing during which we're going to be getting that water and whether we're getting precipitation as snow versus rain is shifting with climate change. And so there's some real concerns about what that's going to mean for wetlands. But I want to spend the rest of the time here talking about invasive species, a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So let's talk about Phragmites, because I think that's why most of you are here. Frag what? What is Phragmites? It is an invasive grass that was introduced from Europe. So, in the middle of the picture here is my European friend Anne, also, I guess, an invasive species, standing in the middle of a big stand of Phragmites. So, you can see how dense it is. You probably can't see how tall it is, and so I'll show you another picture in a second. So, it's not really these small patches of Phragmites that are the problem. Phragmites is a beautiful plant. It's very elegant looking. But it's what happens when a small patch like this turns into this, where it literally takes over. And so we have many places in Utah where it's covering tens, hundreds, thousands of acres. And in fact, on the Great Salt Lake, we have at least 25,000 acres of Phragmites. That's from some research that one of my graduate students did. So, for scale, here is Chad, one of my students. He's more than 6 feet tall. The Phragmites is towering above him. What can live here? There are a few species of birds that can live in Phragmites, but a lot of birds cannot use this as habitat. The seeds are not very nutritious. The plant is too tall, too dense. It's just hard to move through. So it's really not good habitat. So again, here's another picture for scale. This is one of our marsh machines, and actually this is, you can see, this is what we use for actually going out and collecting data in some of our wetlands. So let me show you another quick video clip to give you a sense of what this is like. Oops, that was the wrong one. So this is what it's like to drive through Phragmites. So we're in that big marsh machine. Wait a minute, what is Chad doing there? Chad, are you checking Facebook while you're supposed to be out doing your research? The Friends of Phragmites Facebook page. Okay, what is Chad doing? He is actually, did you see what he has in his hand? He actually has a GPS. You know why he has a GPS? Because he cannot tell where he is in the world, because he is in a massive sea of Phragmites. We could drive for potentially hours and not come across anything else but walls of Phragmites. And so he's actually trying to navigate us. We're out trying to collect data on some of his research plots. So if you're dizzy looking at this, that's because it is dizzying, literally. It's hard to even get a sense of where you are or what you're doing because it's so dense and relentless. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what we're up against. So the issue really is, what do you lose? What you lose is this amazing habitat for all these migratory birds. And that's what really concerns a lot of people. So what's the role of the wetland ecologist? What do we do? Well, we are doing a lot of research looking at why is Phragmites so successful? Why is it taking over? And then also, how can we get rid of it? And so that's where our research comes into play. One of the first things that we did when we started our research program here was to look at how does it spread. It has the potential to spread by two different mechanisms, what we call clonal reproduction. It can send out stems both above ground and below ground. It's clonal because that just implies that it's still attached to the plant. It's all one clone. And it can also spread by seeds. But using special genetic techniques, DNA fingerprinting is one way to look at it, we can get a sense of how much of the spread is by seeds versus by rhizomes. So this is work I did with Dr. Karin Kettenring, and we went out and found Phragmites across Utah. And in different places, we collect a leaf here, we collect a leaf here, and we go many hundreds of meters, thousands of meters apart. And we take all those samples back to the lab, and we look at the fingerprint of each leaf. So if a plant is spreading clonally, it's going to be genetically identical. So each of these different fingerprints would look exactly the same. But if we saw lots of variation, lots of genetic variation, that's an indication of lots of spread by seed. And that is, in fact, what we found. Most of the spread of Phragmites is by seed. Okay, well, that's interesting, but it's also a problem for how we approach management. The way that most people, the common practice across the continent for controlling Phragmites is to spray it in the fall. But by that point, it's actually already produced its seeds. And so I think it's the end result of this research is that people are thinking about, well, how can we better manage this plant to get rid of the existing plant, to spray it, and also prevent it from sending out thousands and thousands of seeds? How do you do that? And so that's where some of the research that Chad's been doing and Christine's been doing, we've been looking at the best way to control Phragmites. We've been looking at different techniques such as mowing it and covering it with black plastic, essentially to try to bake the stems underground. Here's a nice picture of mowing it. Here's one of the herbicide sprayers. And we're trying out all sorts of different techniques. So here's Christine and Chad again, in case you forgot what they looked like. They've got 2 different experiments going on. You can see the different places they're doing these experiments all along the Great Salt Lake, which is one of the cool things about this study, really large scale. So we'll be able to say a lot about how to control Phragmites under different conditions. The stars, the yellow stars are Christine's plots, and the red blobs are Chad's plots. One interesting anecdote related to this, if you are flying into the Salt Lake Airport, have you ever looked out into the marshes? I always have my face glued to the window as I'm coming in, and I think people around me think I'm a little bit strange. But if you look out, well, one, you can see the amazing wetlands out there. But then if you look a little closer, you might find some really strange things. Massive squares in the middle of the marsh. Turns out those are Chad's study plots, as you can see here. This is Farmington Bay. You can actually see his study plots, which are each plot is 3 acres in size. So that's more than 2 football fields in size. So they're massive. So we're trying out different treatments here. And this is kind of, lots of different jargon here. But the things that you need to know are, 1, we're doing different treatments we're doing a bunch of treatments in the summer. Why are we doing that? Because remember that seed reproduction. We're trying to figure out, are there ways that we can deal with Phragmites before it produces seeds? We're also comparing those summer treatments to the regular treatment, the common treatment that people use, this fall glyphosate. What is glyphosate? You know Roundup, right? People use that in their yards. So glyphosate is the same ingredient in Roundup. We use a different version that's approved for wetlands. And then this one other herbicide is imazapyr. It's called Habitat, is its trade name. So we're comparing all these different treatments and trying to figure out what works best. So a question for you all. Anybody have any hypotheses about what you think might be most effective for controlling Phragmites? Any guesses into what might work out of these treatments here? You got an idea? Okay, so I've got a vote for the summer mow black plastic. Well, in fact, that turned out to be the least successful treatment. We were trying to find something other than herbicides to control Phragmites, and it didn't really work. So let me show you what this looks like in terms of pictures. Here's what we found. Before we did the treatments, this is what the Phragmites look like. So our plots were 80 to 100% Phragmites, and there, again, is very tall Chad for scale. This is what a lot of them look like afterwards. Phragmites cover was reduced to almost 20% or less, so that's really good news. The cool thing was, or the interesting thing was, that it didn't matter whether we were spraying in the summer or the fall and which herbicide we were spraying. All of them were actually pretty effective. But back to the seeds, right? I said the way that Phragmites spreads is largely by seeds, so how can we deal with it? Basically, any of those treatments that were done in the fall still resulted, whatever Phragmites was left still produced seeds. These are some results in particular from Christine's study. However, anything that we did in the summer, and this was kind of surprising and exciting to us, any of those treatments that we did in the summertime essentially stopped it from producing seeds. So that was really good news. This has some real clear management implications. But the really important question is, can we restore habitat for all those migratory birds? can we actually get the native vegetation to return? Oops. And so for the most part, we're having two things happen. Either we're getting a bunch of weedy species coming back, as you can see here, or not much is coming back at all because of the Phragmites carcasses, so to speak. So when you spray Phragmites, it just stays there. It dies, it falls down when we mow it. But then what we have is what we call a litter layer, a deep layer of dead Phragmites, and it essentially blocks any light for plants to be able to come back. And so that's a real problem going forward, because what we're trying to do is restore habitat. Okay, so about 3 more slides here. I just want to bring it home and maybe put a little bit more positive spin on our work to actually restore these wetlands. So we're particularly trying to restore bulrushes. We're trying to restore these species that produce good nutritious seeds for migratory birds and that provide good habitat. So the species we're focusing on are called alkali bulrush, hard stem bulrush, and 3 square. You can see what the different stems look like if you actually cut them in cross section. And here is a picture of alkali bulrush seeds. If you go out after the presentation and you go find the table with the duck gizzards, you will find lots of bulrush seeds in duck gizzards. The birds are all just devouring this. They're pigging out on the bulrush, on the alkali bulrush seeds, and some of the other bulrush seeds. So we've come a long way in terms of how we approach restoration. Revegetation is actually what we call it. So we're trying to put the native plants back. Back in the days of the Civilian Conservation Corps, it was maybe a little bit more haphazard. We dig up a plant here and we chuck it over there. Well, I think we're a little bit more sophisticated in how we approach it now. And so there's a couple different things that we're trying out in our lab. The first thing is we're actually looking at different ways to seed and plant. And so you might imagine that there's benefits and drawbacks to different approaches you might use. So for instance, if you were trying to restore habitat over thousands of acres, seeds are probably super easy, right? Because you can cover a much larger area. However, seeds are much less successful, probably. Plugs are another strategy. So these are lawns, literally, of wetland plants that is somebody's growing in a native plant nursery. You can see a plug here, and it's essentially just a plug of lots of seedlings, pretty hardy seedlings. And so you can go out and plant those. And then a more recent strategy that people have developed is what's called sod mats. And this is coconut fiber. You can see here, and there are little plants in there. They can grow out over a year, and then you essentially move them out into wetlands and can use them to again restore bulrushes. So one of the studies that David England is going to be leading up this year, we're going to be comparing these different treatments, seeing how rapidly can we get the bulrushes to come back and which ones are most effective at keeping out Phragmites. Okay, one last slide. And this is actually one of the most interesting things that we're doing and potentially one of the more successful ways to bring back bulrushes. It has to do with genetic diversity. Okay, look around the room. Everybody here is, does anybody have an identical twin in the room? Okay, if you don't have an identical twin, then there's nobody else in the room who has the same genetic makeup as you. We're all genetically unique. We all have different genotypes. Okay? Look at this picture. Everybody's different. Well, the same concept applies to plants. When you look out into a sea of plants, there are lots of different genotypes. They're all genetically different and they do different things. So you look a little bit more closely and you might find out that some of the alkali bulrush plants are tall and some have broader leaves. And some might be short and tiny and fill in little spaces. Why do you think that would matter for restoring wetlands that can keep out Phragmites? Any ideas? You got an idea?
Because if they're tall and have broad leaves, limit sunlight and such to Phragmites.
Limit sunlight and such. That is exactly right. Okay, so the light, right? Cassidy hit right on it. So I said Phragmites is invading by seeds largely. How do you keep those seeds from germinating? A lot of it has to do by limiting light. And so if we can put in combinations of genotypes that are all doing different things, they would potentially limit the light that would get to the ground and get to the Phragmites seeds. And so that's actually, this is kind of it is an innovative approach to restoration. And this is a project that Jimmy Marty is leading up, where we're going to be looking at different combinations of genotypes of bulrushes and seeing how they can prevent Phragmites from returning to these marshes. So with that, I will close, and hopefully you're leaving here with a better understanding of the role of wetlands in our livelihoods and in our health. That Great Salt Lake wetlands are unique, and particularly all the various bird species you got to see. The challenges that we're facing both here in Utah and actually across North America in terms of Phragmites invasion. And also hopefully you have a sense of some of the things that wetland ecologists and our research, how research can be used to improve restoration. So with that, I hope you are motivated to go out and explore some wetlands in Utah, and I'd be happy to take any questions from the audience. Any questions? We've got one in the back there.
What is your favorite thing that you figured out or found while exploring wetlands?
Okay, I think I heard you. What is my most favorite thing that I found while exploring wetlands? You know, what I find is the coolest thing about wetlands are what wetland plants do, and the cool wetland plants are plants that eat animals. Who has ever seen a carnivorous plant? Holy cow, they are cool. A lot of wetlands, particularly up in northern US and up in Canada, are peatlands. They have very low nutrient availability. The plants can't get the nutrients they need, the food they need to grow. So they have this adaptation to actually capture insects and small mammals and eat them, which is truly amazing. So if you ever have the chance to go explore a bog, in particular, you can look for the carnivorous plants. That was a great question. Cassidy.
Have you ever gotten lost in Phragmites?
Have I ever gotten lost in Phragmites? I have not, but there actually was there were some hunters last year who got lost out, and they had to bring in actually a search helicopter to find them. They'd been out there for hours and could not figure out where they were. So it is completely possible, so don't wander alone in Phragmites. Okay, you got a question?
If you're trying to make the bulrush grow out so it makes it so Phragmites can't grow, wouldn't that make it so new bulrush can grow out also?
Okay, we've got a good question here. So if we're trying to get bulrushes to grow and essentially fill in all the spaces, would that keep out other bulrushes? And that is potentially that potentially could happen. But that is, even if we get some bulrushes to grow, that's actually a good thing. If we have any bulrushes at all, they're going to be providing good habitat for wildlife. So, but that's a great point.
You mentioned they're from Europe. They have a problem similarly in Europe? How are they?
Right. So Phragmites is from Europe. What is happening with Phragmites in Europe? Phragmites in Europe is declining. And it actually is a big conservation concern there. And so there's been so we have generously offered to send our Phragmites back to them. But there's been actually huge research efforts on the part of ecologists there to try to figure out why is it declining.
Well, if they figure that out, then they can tell you. And
Yes.
you can do the same thing.
Exactly, right. So how can we mimic what's happening there so we don't have the same problem here? Yeah, no, that's a great point. You have a question?
What's your favorite color?
What's my favorite color? Probably green, because I love plants. The question in the back with the turquoise shirt there. What was the point of bringing Phragmites into the U.S.? I don't think it was intentional, but we think it originally arrived actually a long time ago, and the seed heads, you might have noticed, are nice and puffy. They were probably used as packing material when people were, so literally 150 years ago, people were using it as packing material. And so it was introduced along the Atlantic coast, and it kind of stayed there for many, many decades. And then maybe over the last 30 years, it really took off, and we think that's partly because of what we have done to our our aquatic water bodies, our wetlands and rivers. We have polluted them, and Phragmites does really well under high nitrogen, high fertilized conditions, and then it really exploded just over the last few decades. Question in the back.
Why is the only thing that you want to bring back bulrush?
It is not the only thing that we want to bring back. So the question is, why is the only thing we want to bring back is why just bulrushes? We're working on 3 different species, and part of the reason we're doing that is because alkali bulrush in particular is the most critical emergent wetland plant for wildlife. There are lots of other plants, and we will eventually broaden our horizons, but right now we're going to start with what we know is most critical and kind of work our way outward. Each of these projects takes tons of money and time, and so we can't do it all. We have to kind of prioritize. Question there? Yep.
Can any animal get lost with Phragmites?
Can any animal do what with Phragmites? Eat it?
Get lost.
Oh, get lost. Probably. I don't know. It's possible. Okay, question in the back there.
How fast does Phragmites grow?
How fast does it grow? Wow. It depends on what conditions it's growing in. Under ideal conditions, it could grow, well taller than I am in a single year. If the soil has lots of salt in it, or if there's not much water, not much moisture in the soil, it may be pretty stunted. But maybe you're also thinking about spread horizontally, and so it can spread many meters, many yards in a year, actually. And that would be more by clonal spread. Those seeds, though, they get caught in the wind like dandelion seeds, and those can spread hundreds of meters. Yeah?
Is there any, or do you know any projects with people working on reusing or coming up with some use for the material of dead Phragmites?
Yep, there are lots of people thinking about what to do with all that dead Phragmites. There was a big push a couple years ago here in Utah to think about how to use it as a biofuel. It did not quite take off. But right now, the biggest potential use is actually for cattle, and there's a big push now to use cattle to graze Phragmites, which would be one way to manage it, and also be a good food source for cattle. So it could potentially be a win-win situation.
So maybe we should stop now, and if you have more questions, you can come down and talk to Karin. I think you probably see why she's such a terrific professor and why so many students want to work with her. She does interesting research that's important for the world and our understanding of it. She knows a lot of really interesting ecology, a lot about wetlands and other things, and she's a lot of fun. And so let's thank Karin again.